Hello and welcome to my channel. I hope you enjoy this story. I'm going to try and upload a new story each day. The Shadowed Attic. The house on the Isle of Wight stood like a sentinel of forgotten times, its Victorian architecture looming against the fog that rolled in from the sea. Holly Arnold had lived in the house her whole life, but it wasn't until her 12th summer that the attic began to call to her. Holly was a curious child, the type to poke through boxes and drawers, always on the lookout for hidden treasures in the house's dusty corners. Her father had warned her not to go into the attic. He said the beams were rotten, the floor unstable, but that only made her more eager. There were too many unanswered questions in this house, and Holly had grown tired of her father's evasions. One grey afternoon, with rain tapping lightly against the windows, she found herself standing at the bottom of the narrow staircase leading to the attic door. It was the only part of the house she hadn't yet explored. The door had always been locked, but recently she had found an old, rusty key in the library, tucked between the pages of a worn leather book. She knew what it was for. She hesitated only for a moment before fitting the key into the lock. With a soft click, the door creaked open, revealing the dark maw of the attic beyond. Dust hung thick in the air, and the stale smell of disuse filled her nostrils. The wooden stairs groaned under her weight as she ascended, flashlight in hand, heart thudding in her chest. The attic was vast, much larger than she expected. Low beams crisscrossed above her head, and the floor was littered with old furniture covered in white sheets, boxes stacked haphazardly, and forgotten heirlooms that seemed to whisper of the past. The light from her flashlight cut through the thick dust, revealing fragments of an old life, porcelain dolls with cracked faces, yellowed photographs, and furniture no one had used in decades. But as she swept the beam across the far corner, her breath caught. There was something there, something her father had never mentioned. A door hidden in the shadows, barely visible behind an old wardrobe. It was small, just tall enough for her to pass through, and painted a faded, peeling black. Holly had never seen it before. She didn't remember any door like this when she had been downstairs. Her curiosity flared. She approached it cautiously, her fingers trailing along the old wood. There was no handle, no keyhole. Just a cold metallic surface. Holly pressed her hand against it and felt the chill run through her fingertips like ice beneath her skin. Suddenly, the door creaked open, revealing a room bathed in shadow. Holly stepped inside, her flashlight flickering as she crossed the threshold. The air was colder here, sharper, and the shadows seemed to move, shifting and writhing on the walls. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, tricks of the light playing on her nerves, but as she moved deeper into the room, the figures began to take shape. There were people here. No, not people figures. Shadowy, indistinct, their forms wavering as if seen through a thick veil of mist. They lined the walls, silent and still, their faces obscured by the darkness that clung to them like a tower. Holly's heart raced, but something in the back of her mind whispered that she was safe, that they wouldn't harm her as long as she didn't draw their attention. She tried to step backward, but her feet seemed glued to the floor. The flashlight in her hand dimmed, the beam growing weaker by the second. She felt the shadows around her closing in, suffocating her, pressing against her skin. The room seemed alive, a breathing, pulsating entity that swallowed all light and hope. The shadows weren't just figures, they were watching her, waiting. Suddenly, a soft voice echoed from the corner of the room, the child's whisper. "Ah, Holly." The voice was familiar, though she couldn't place it. Slowly, she turned the flashlight toward the sound, its weak glow illuminating a small figure huddled in the far corner. A girl, no older than Holly herself, with wide, vacant eyes and a pale face. She was dressed in old-fashioned clothes, a simple white nightgown stained with something dark and wet at the hem. "Ah." Holly's voice trembled as she spoke. The girl tilted her head, her eyes glistening with tears. "Oh, I live here. I've always lived here. Don't you remember?" Holly's mind raced. She had never seen her before, but there was something disturbingly familiar about her. The shadows around them seemed to ripple, as if they were reacting to the girl's presence. "I don't understand," Holly said. The girl stepped forward, her bare feet silent on the cold floor. She stopped just inches from Holly, her breath cold as it brushed against Holly's cheek. You need to leave," the girl said. "They're coming. They'll take you if you stay." Holly's heart thundered in her chest. Who's coming?" Before the girl could answer, the shadows around them began to stir. Holly could feel it now, the presence of something ancient and malevolent. The air grew thick, and a deep, guttural sound echoed from the depths of the room. "They're awake," the girl whispered. "You have to leave now." Without another word, the girl turned and vanished into the shadows. Desperation surged through Holly's veins as she stumbled backward, her eyes darting around the room for an escape. But the door she had come through was gone. There was only the suffocating darkness, and within it the faint outline of the shadowy figures growing clearer, their shapes more distinct. And then she saw them eyes. Dozens of them, glowing faintly in the dark, watching her from the corners of the room. They were hungry, ravenous, and their gaze burned into her soul like icy fire. Holly turned and ran, her legs carrying her blindly through the oppressive blackness, her mind reeling with terror. But no matter how fast she ran, the shadows were faster. They swirled around her, wrapping her in their cold embrace. Just as the darkness seemed to swallow her whole, Holly's hand brushed against something solid. The door. She didn't hesitate. With all her strength, she yanked it open and tumbled through, slamming it shut behind her. The attic was still. Dust motes floated lazily in the dim light of her flashlight, which had miraculously sprung back to life. The hidden room was gone, nothing but an empty wall where the door had once been. Panting, Holly stumbled down the stairs, her mind racing. The attic was silent, as if nothing had happened. But as she reached the bottom and stepped into the hallway, she froze. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed darker now, more alive. And in the distance, from somewhere deep within the house, a soft, familiar whisper echoed. "Oh, Holly, I'm still here." They had followed her, and now they were part of the house. Holly Arnold had unlocked something far worse than her father's secrets. She had unlocked the darkness. The days that followed felt like a waking nightmare for Holly. The house on the Isle of Wight had always been old, creaky, and full of strange sounds, but now it was something more. The shadows no longer merely lingered in the corners, they moved, stretched, and shifted when she wasn't looking. Sometimes, when she passed the mirror in the hallway or glanced into a darkened room, she could see them, the glowing eyes watching her, always watching. Her father noticed her restlessness. "You've been acting strange lately," he said one evening over dinner. "Is everything all right?" Holly, she wanted to tell him about the attic, the hidden door, and the shadowy figures that had followed her out, but every time she opened her mouth to speak, a weight pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe, let alone explain. She glanced at the shadows on the walls, noticing how they seemed to loom larger now, darker, as though they were listening. "I'm fine," she mumbled. Tired. That night Holly lay in bed. The house groaned with its usual symphony of old wood settling and distant pipes rattling, but beneath it all she could hear something else, a soft, persistent whisper. It was like the voice from the attic, but now it came from all around her, circling her room like a predator stalking its prey. Holly, Holly, she squeezed her eyes shut, pulling the covers over her head, but the voice only grew louder. We were waiting. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped. She felt it before she saw the weight of something standing at the foot of her bed. Slowly, trembling, Holly pulled the blanket down just enough to peek over the edge. A figure stood there. Not the pale girl from the attic, but something far worse. It was a shadow, tall and formless, but its eyes burned with an unnatural light, fixated on her. It leaned forward, as though inspecting her, and Holly felt her heart hammering in her chest, every instinct screaming at her to run. But she couldn't move. She was frozen in place, trapped under its gaze. The shadow bent lower, whispering in a voice that felt like ice in her veins. "You shouldn't have opened the door." Holly's breath hitched. What do you want?" "We want what was taken from us. You brought us back." Holly pleaded, her voice trembling. "I didn't know." The shadow's hand reached out, its fingers long and sharp. Holly braced herself, but instead of touching her, it pointed toward the attic. "You will return, and finish what you started." Before she could react, the figure vanished. The oppressive weight lifted, and Holly bolted upright, gasping for air. Her room was empty, but the shadows seemed thicker now, more alive. She knew this wasn't over. They wanted something from her, and they weren't going to leave until she gave it to them. The next morning, Holly knew what she had to do. She couldn't keep pretending nothing was wrong. She had to go back to the attic. With a sick feeling in her stomach, she waited until her father left for town, then grabbed her flashlight and climbed the stairs once again. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though something unseen was trying to pull her back. But she forced herself onward, the memories of the shadowy figures in her mind. When she reached the attic door, it was already slightly ajar, as if the house had been expecting her. Inside, the attic was just as she'd left it, dusty, cluttered, and eerie in the dim light. But the hidden door was back, standing tall and black against the far wall. Its presence felt more menacing now, as though it were alive, watching her just as the shadows did. Holly approached it cautiously, her hand shaking as she reached for the handle. This time there was no hesitation. The door creaked open, and she stepped into the shadowed room once more. The figures were waiting for her. But now they were clearer, more defined. They stood in a circle, surrounding a small, ancient-looking chest in the center of the room. The girl from before was there too, her face pale and sorrowful, her eyes filled with an unspeakable sadness. "You shouldn't have come back." "I didn't have a choice," Holly said. "What do you want from me?" "You need to open it. It's the only way to set us free." The shadows shifted restlessly around her, their eyes following her every move. She knelt before the chest, her hands trembling as she reached for the latch. The wood was cold to the touch, almost as if it had been carved from ice. She hesitated for a moment, then, with a deep breath, lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in the velvet-lined interior, was a small, ornate key. The moment she touched it, the room erupted in a deafening roar. The shadows writhed and twisted, their forms dissolving into smoke and ash. The girl's face contorted in pain, her body shimmering as though she were being pulled apart. Holly shouted, but it was too late. The shadows engulfed the girl, pulling her into the darkness. One by one, the figures disappeared, leaving only the oppressive silence of the room. Holly stood alone in the attic, the key clutched tightly in her hand. The whispers were gone, the shadows banished, but deep in her heart she knew this wasn't over. The key in her hand felt heavy, filled with dark promises and ancient secrets. Whatever she had unleashed, it wasn't finished with her yet. And somewhere, in the depths of the house, the shadows were waiting. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this story. Please don't forget to like, and even better, like and subscribe. Thank you very much, and I hope you have had or have a great day.